Okay, well, it's Easter. It's Resurrection Sunday, and I'm so glad that each one of you is here and celebrating the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. I always struggle with Easter in one respect, and I'll share this with you because you might not know this about me. This is a pastoral thing. This is not something that would bug me if I wasn't a pastor. But as a pastor, I feel like Easter is kind of like the Super Bowl of our sermon schedule. You get people there who are not Christians often. The doors of the church are wide open and you have no idea who's going to be there, but you do know that you need to really try to knock it out of the park. At least that's how I feel. And maybe that is more pressure than I need to put on myself. But this year, of course, everything is so different anyways. I almost haven't had time to be stressed out about it. You know, it's a very simple idea. It's the idea that Christianity started in a period of 3 days. On the front end of those 3 days, Jesus Christ was crucified, and 3 days later, his tomb was empty. And over the course of those 3 days, something new was introduced into history, into the human race, into creation that never happened before, but that God had seen for thousands of years beforehand and was planning from the very moment that Adam and Eve were driven out of the Garden of Eden. So this idea that Jesus Christ died and then later he was not dead, that's it. That is the beginning of everything for us. Now, when I was younger, there was a lot of talk in the church about keeping all of our religious conversation in the realm of objective truth. And what was meant by that usually was, how do we know if a thing is actually true? Or if it's something that we're just saying because we think it or it's an opinion. And over the course of the last 40 years, certainly within my own lifetime, a little bit before that actually, our whole culture has been moving away from caring about objective truth. It's always as important as it was. It's just that many people don't think that it matters. And in fact, it actually does matter. It matters tremendously. But when I was younger, a lot of Easter sermons centered around the reasons that we can be sure that Jesus Christ really did rise from the dead. And I heard a lot of those sermons growing up. I heard a lot of those sermons even as an adult. I like to listen to apologetics messages and read books. And so sometimes I get so much information about a certain topic that I forget that not everyone gets to hear it as often as I do. And so sometimes I just assume things, and it would be better if I cover those bases just to make sure that everyone gets to hear them. So the first thing I'm going to do today is talk about a couple of things that have been suggested down through the years as possible explanations for the empty tomb in a way that could maybe get around the idea of the resurrection. You see, a lot of people do not want to believe or admit the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I understand where that comes from. I'm not sympathetic with it, but I understand it. And so people who feel that way, oftentimes they want to come up with an alternative theory. There are lots of them. I'm not going to cover all of them. I'm only going to talk about just some of the ones that I have heard the most often. And one of them, of course, is the idea that the disciples stole the body. I hear this idea on occasion, even in popular fiction. The idea that Jesus Christ died, the disciples knew that he had promised to come back to life, so they snuck in, got his body, and escaped. Why does that not work? Well, for many reasons. Here's some of the obvious ones. We know from the New Testament record that there was a guard around the tomb. Even if you assume that the guard was all asleep, you couldn't have the disciples sneaking past the guard, moving a 3-ton stone without waking them up, getting the body out of the tomb, hiding it, and then perjuring themselves for what they knew was a lie when they were tortured for their faith in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It just doesn't hold water. But that's okay, because there's other theories out there that people have tried to suggest from time to time. One of them is the idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, he just passed out. And then later, they put his body in the tomb, and the cold air in the tomb kind of revived him, and he got out on his own. There's a lot of reasons that one doesn't hold water either, but I feel like saying it out loud demonstrates the silliness of it. But here's the major reasons why it doesn't work. First of all, the Roman soldiers knew how to kill people. The Roman soldiers were well trained in a few things, and one of the things they were really well trained at was how to make sure a person was dead. That is how the Roman Empire survived. That's how the Roman Empire grew and protected its borders and subjugated people. So when they put a spear in his side and pierced his heart, it wasn't because they thought it would make, great religious art 2,000 years later. It was to make certain that Jesus Christ was really dead as he hung there on the cross. Even if that wasn't the case, the idea that Jesus could have lost all that blood on the cross, then woke up and resuscitated and moved the stone himself in his weakened condition, and let alone that, but then also walk like 3 miles back into town, get to where his disciples were, and then appear to them and convince them that he had power over death. Even if he had made it that far, he would not have looked like someone who had power over death. He would look like someone who had been run over by a truck. So in no way does that theory make any sense at all. There's also the idea that they went to the wrong tomb after they buried Jesus Christ. I shouldn't have to refute this one either, but I have heard this theory suggested, so I'm going to tell you why it's hogwash. The main reason is because my Uncle Bob. I was about 8 or 9 when he passed away. We buried him in a place where you would expect people to be buried. He was not the only person buried there, but a few days later, my family went back and visited, and we had no trouble remembering exactly where he was because he was important to us. Not only that, but about 40 years later, I went back to that part of the world for a trip with my wife, and we happened to be in that same area, so we stopped by, and I was able to walk to the right tombstone just in a matter of minutes because it made that much of an impact on me. The idea that the disciples could have followed Jesus' heart and soul for that long and then forgot where they put his body is ludicrous. And I'll tell you what the topper is for me. The topper is that the first person to find the empty tomb and Jesus there was a woman, and as we all know, the women are not the ones who are losing things, it's the men who are losing things all the time. So I have confidence that the wrong tomb theory is ludicrous for all kinds of reasons. Serious as well as funny. A couple decades ago, a prominent theologian came up with an idea. I don't know what a theologian is doing coming up with ideas like this, but this is what he said. He said, after Jesus died, the disciples got together to commemorate his life. And they were having such a moving experience remembering him, it felt like he was with them. And over time, the more they got together, the more it felt like he was there. And that sort of convinced people that he really wasn't dead after all. And eventually people started to believe he really came back to life. The only way to make that work is to throw out all 4 Gospels in which he appears to people, especially Matthew, Luke, and John, I guess I should say, not to mention the book of Acts, where Jesus not only appeared to the disciples before they felt his presence in any kind of a worship scenario, ate with them, touched them physically, and had to convince them that he was in fact alive. They did not convince themselves. They could not have convinced themselves. They were so heartbroken with grief that Jesus was dead that it would have been impossible for them to lift themselves up by their own bootstraps, as it were, and convince themselves that he somehow had come to life in some mysterious spiritual sense. Aside from which, if they had done that, and if they had then convinced themselves wrongly that he was alive physically just because they felt like he was in the room with them, they would have had to be more lacking in intelligence than they obviously were for, having been able to write the Gospels. They were smarter than that. Nobody in the ancient world believed in any way, shape, or form that if a person died, they could get up and walk around 3 days later. Death is not a scientific fact that we discovered in the 1800s. People have always known that when you're dead, you stay dead. That's why the disciples had to be convinced. That's why they weren't expecting it, even though they should have been, because Jesus talked about his resurrection before even his own death. But when Paul was trying to convince people about the resurrection in Acts 17, it tells us that some of the busiest and the most dedicated and the most deliberate thinkers of the time put him up in front of the whole Areopagus in order to defend his ideas, because they didn't know what he was talking about. And it says in Acts 17 that when he mentioned the resurrection of the dead, some of them laughed, and everyone said, "We will hear you again on this matter." In other words, they were perfectly willing to listen to Paul talk about Jesus as a Jewish person or a Messiah, or as the start or the leader of a new movement, or someone with some religious ideas. But the instant Paul started talking about Jesus Christ as someone who had power over death, they checked right out. And they didn't want to hear any more. Not because they thought it was a dangerous idea, but because they thought it was a ludicrous idea. They thought it was foolishness. They laughed him right off the stage. I believe that if they had let him finish his sermon, it would have been one of the greatest sermons ever preached, but now we don't know how it would have ended because they laughed him off the stage. It's very, very tragic. Paul never once wavered from that resurrection story. In fact, you will recall that Paul started out by persecuting the church and only became a believer in Jesus Christ after he had a personal eyewitness encounter with Jesus. I saw the Lord, he said. He saw Jesus Christ face to face. And he was one, for different reasons, who also did not want to be convinced that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. And yet he became the most vocal, outspoken witness, apostle for the resurrection truth. When he was arrested and he was being put on trial before Festus, who was the Roman governor at the time, and they were about to send him to Rome in order to stand trial for being one of these Christians, they gave him an opportunity to stand before a Jewish ruler, King Agrippa, and his wife Bernice, and explain what it was he actually believed. And the way he did that was to tell his story. I was on my way to Damascus. I saw a great light, and then it knocked me off my feet, and there he was. He shared his testimony about having seen Jesus Christ. In fact, when he was starting out his testimony, he said, he was talking to a sophisticated Roman official and the Jewish king. He said this: "Why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? Why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? I think that's a good question for Paul to have asked the Roman, highly educated Roman of his day, because back then they really studied logic and rhetoric. And they knew logic better than most people alive today, in general. They invented the use of classical logic and reasoning and rhetoric. So they would have known how to really identify an argument that had a good basis. So they believed, this guy would have believed that his refusal of the resurrection was logical. It's based on the fact that when someone dies, they stay dead. Paul wanted to introduce a question which really would be good for our day as well. And his question was this: why should we rule out the possibility that God would raise the dead? Why would we consider it too hard for God to bring someone to life? What exactly does that question do? What it does is it reintroduces into the idea of death a totally different concept. A concept that maybe, just maybe, it's possible that death is not the final the final victor, the final word, the way it seems to us. I mean, we all know, we've all had loved ones pass away. We all know that death is, in one sense, final, or it seems final to us. But just because we've never witnessed someone come back to life, does that mean it's impossible? Should not. It's not something we've experienced, but there's a lot of things that I haven't experienced that are still possible. All you have to do is ask yourself the question: if God wanted to raise someone to life from the dead, could he do so? Is that possible? And as soon as you ask the question that way, you are actually being more open-minded than the most rigorous scientist on earth. Any scientist who asks a question has to consider all possibilities and rule them out one at a time. Many modern people start by closing their mind to the possibility of resurrection and assuming that it's impossible before we even ask the question. If you do that, of course, you're going to conclude that Jesus really didn't rise from the dead. But if you open yourself to the possibility, then what you will discover is that allows us to say, if God did want to raise someone from the dead, he certainly could have done so. And all of a sudden, all of the theories that have been formed for all these years and centuries to try and account for the empty tomb really appear as what they are. They appear as desperate, grasping efforts to deny a truth which, since it is true, changes everything for everyone. And here's how it changes everything for everyone. And it changes so many things, I can't really list them all, but I'd like to try and do justice to the change in the time that we have available to us. Number one, it means that we don't have to fear death. I think that this is very, very important because we are right now in a very particular, unique time in our country's history where the fear of dying is practically calling the shots and running the agenda for our country. I don't want to say that death is no big deal. I understand death is a big deal. I don't want to die anytime soon. I don't want anyone I love to die anytime soon. But 200 some years ago, there were people who were afraid of losing their freedoms more than they were afraid of dying. They realized that there's worse things that can happen to you than dying. I do not get the sense in this day and age that we feel like there's anything worse that could ever happen to a person than dying. And the reason that's sad is because you can't avoid it. It's going to happen to each of us. If the worst possible thing you can imagine is inevitable, doesn't that make your whole life kind of hopeless? The answer is yes. So when Jesus Christ conquered death and extended to his followers the promise that they too could experience eternal life, it takes some of the sting out of death. We still grieve, but not as those who have no hope. So, death is not the thing I fear most in this life. And even though it's not something I want to experience anytime soon, I know it's inevitable for me. Physically, I will die one day, and my problems will be over. So, that's all I'm going to say about that. Another way that Jesus' resurrection changes everything for everyone is that it establishes his credibility. I mean, you've all heard this before. How many different religions have been started by how many different people down through the years? The answer is nobody really knows. There's too many to count. There are religions that have flourished and had millions of followers and then vanished from the face of the earth that we don't even know about and will never know about because they left no record behind. You add all of those hypothetical or those inevitable past religious movements to the ones we know about, hundreds of different religious movements. I remember a couple of years ago, I read about there was a terrorist incident in a country in Asia. It wasn't China, but it was an Asian country. And this terrorist incident was perpetrated by people who were following a man who claimed to be the incarnation of God. They worshiped him by drinking his bathwater. Worst religion ever. Okay? I mean, but then they all end up getting arrested. It seems like anybody could start a religion and find someone somewhere to follow them. There's only one person, though, who did that and then conquered death. And that victorious resurrection alone is what sets Jesus Christ apart, above and beyond every other alternative, every other option out there. You can't put Jesus Christ on a shelf with all the other religious leaders and say, here's some good options, find one you like. He's in a different category completely. And the only way people can pretend he belongs over here with everyone else is if they deny the resurrection. That's part of what's behind it. Here's another thing's behind it. Here's the third thing that I want to mention, and then I'll wrap it up. The third thing that changes because of the resurrection, we now know that Jesus Christ, by conquering death, he's demonstrated to be Lord of all. Okay? And God's Word tells us that God has proven who Jesus is. He's demonstrated it to everyone by raising him from the dead, which means that Jesus Christ's role as Lord is going to reach a point where he acts as judge. That means everyone who is born, whatever their beliefs, whatever their religion, whatever their nationality, is one day going to have to stand in front of the only person who ever conquered death and answer to him for how they spent their life. So whether you are a believer in Jesus Christ or not, whether you are born in America or Africa or Asia or Europe or Australia, whatever your condition, because Jesus Christ came back to life after his crucifixion, he is the one who will judge our lives and determine our eternal destiny. Those are three things that spring out of the resurrection, and I believe that we need to be aware and thinking about those things constantly. They affect not only what we believe to be true about our eternal destiny, but also our day-to-day, moment-by-moment life here on this earth.